Hey friends, welcome to the Empowered Homes Podcast. The purpose of this podcast is to grow strong families by connecting church and home. Meg is in studio. We're sitting here on our computers because we got a special guest via Zoom. Andrew Walker. Andrew, we've already hung out with you. We love you. Andrew was one of our keynote speakers for the Empowered Homes Conference last year, talking about gender, sexuality, and the gospel, and had a great time. We'll link that video if you want to go back and watch the content from that conference. We'll link that to the description of this episode. But Andrew, welcome, man. Glad you're here.
Yeah, hey, thanks for the invitation, and good to be back with some familiar people and a familiar institution and group, so who's doing good work. So thanks for the invitation.
Man, we're so grateful, and some of our audience will know who you are, but for those who don't, just share a little bit about yourself, your family, and kind of what you do.
Yeah, so my big title, I guess, is Associate Professor of Christian Ethics and Public Theology at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary here in Louisville, Kentucky. Been here for just at 5 years, and as I joke with people, my area of my discipline is ethics, which oftentimes conjures up a lot of different thoughts, but the easiest way to describe it is everything uncomfortable and controversial that people don't want to talk about, I talk about for a living in the classroom. So that makes my job very fun and lively. And then been married to my wife, Christian, going on, it'll be 18 years this December. And she's a fifth grade teacher at our local classical Christian school, actually about literally a quarter mile from the seminary here. And it's her actual first day of classes. So interesting day for her. And we've got 3 daughters, Caroline, who is 13, going on 22, Catherine, who is 9, almost 10, and then Charlotte, who is 6. So just 3 girls, actually 4 girls if you count my wife, and me and a male dog named Buckley. So that rounds out the maleness in the home.
Oh, that's awesome. So cool to hear about your family, exciting things going on in your life. One of the main reasons we got you on the episode is you got a new book. Yeah, love it. Me and Meghan have been talking through it. We've come through it.
Thank you so much.
The book's called "What Do I Say When?" A Parent's Guide to Navigating Cultural Chaos for Children and Teens. We'll talk about the book here in a little bit. That's super exciting. But something else happened today. I just saw on Twitter. Tell us, what was that about? What happened today? Something cool.
Yeah, so there's like a ceremonial kind of symbolic mark of being on faculty at Southern that usually comes when you're earlier in your career, hopefully around like year 5 or 6, if you kind of pass all the tests. And if you pass the tests with some interviews, you become elected to the faculty of Southern Seminary, which is kind of maybe the Southern Baptist equivalent of tenure is what you might call it. But it culminates in signing the original abstract of principles from 1859 that every elected faculty member of Southern has signed. So it's a really symbolic moment at the seminary because it's our commitment to teach in accordance with and not contrary to the doctrinal confession and parameters of this institution. And so we literally sign the document handwritten in 1859 that governed the institution. And so, you sign this old book with a actual like quill, which was interesting to use a quill. So we had to practice that in advance. But yeah, signed that book about 3 hours ago, and just a major moment of honestly, today I'm just overwhelmed with gratitude. I began at Southern 16 years ago as a student, and idealized perhaps teaching ethics someday, and sitting here 16 years later, being an elected member of the faculty, teaching ethics is just completely undeserved grace. And so I'm just very grateful today.
Man, when I saw that, I just thought, what a cool testimony to sign your name in that book with so many people that went before you, but then thinking
Yep.
of how many people are going to sign it after you, and just
Yep.
really,
Absolutely.
really cool, man. I'm proud for you, and just wanted to share that. When I saw it, I was like, oh man, that's incredible. So
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that.
yeah, awesome.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I also commented, you have a really very nice signature. And the fact that you signed it with a quill, I'm like really impressed that it looks so good.
Yeah.
That would be very nerve-wracking. So that's awesome.
I was very intentional and slow in trying to sign that, but not only signing it, but not like dropping any of the ink to create a blot on the page, which has happened previously. So I was like, don't be that guy. Don't screw this up, Walker.
Don't smear your hand across the whole thing after you signed it. Yeah,
exactly.
That's awesome. Well, we love your work and following and seeing what the Lord is doing through you. And we know that by being an advocate of biblical truth in the political arena, you encounter a lot of people with very strong opinions pretty regularly, right? We know that about you.
No, never.
Okay, but here's an arena that I think a lot of people have strong opinions about, and I want to know from you what your opinion is or what you do. So it's, what do people listen to when they exercise or run? Because we saw in your bio that you're an avid long-distance runner, and so we want to know.
Yes.
What do you listen to when you run?
Wow. I've never been asked that question on a podcast. Thanks. Because I am profoundly boring, but the one thing that I actually think that makes me somewhat cool on the spectrum is I've got I think a pretty good taste of music.
Okay.
I grew up in kind of the Midwest punk rock, emo, indie scene. And so I really never have matured out of that, although I have a wide repertoire of music that I appreciate. So the music you're going to hear most often would be a combination of, and this is not necessarily Christian bands, so I apologize. I can't give an endorsement of these bands, so to be clear on the podcast. But bands like Death Cab for Cutie, Alkaline Trio, that's kind of my native genre. But then I also I listen to way too many podcasts because my world is kind of one where I have to know what's going on in the world around me. Mm-hmm. That's a part of, I love that. But it's also a part of, I think, my professional responsibilities is to know what's happening in the world. So it's usually a mixture, or one day it's a podcast listened to at like 1.5 speed in order I can get through it. Or music, depending on kind of my vibe for the day, whether I want to like tune out or tune in. That also depends on the intensity of the run. So if it's an intense run, more music, more relaxed run, it's going to be a podcast.
That's cool. And what's the longest you've ever run?
Oh, so I've done 5 marathons.
Wow.
So that's 26.2. And actually, I am one of those weird ducks who actually really loves like long distance running. And so for me, like I run 5 days a week, at least 3 miles or 3.3 miles per day when I run. But I actually would prefer to run 8 to 10 miles if I was going to do a run, because for whatever reason, the way God made me, I actually enjoy running the further I go and get stronger the further I go. So it's that's how I know that like God made me a distance runner and not a sprinter.
Yes. That's awesome.
That's awesome. I do like podcasts while I'm going to. It kind of gets my mind off the pain. So what's before we jump into the book, what's a podcast that you would recommend to our parents?
Oh goodness. So I listen to so many. What are I really, and again, I can't give these podcasts like a full-throated Christian endorsement, but there's a podcast called the Ruthless Podcast, which is 4 guys who are on the political kind of conservative side of things, and they're not Christians, or maybe if they are, they're not overly well discipled Christians by some of the language that they use, but they at least provide some levity to politics. And I also enjoy, and I'm not just saying this because he's my boss, but when Dr. Mohler does, he does the Briefing podcast every day, which I enjoy. He does the Thinking in Public podcast, which is kind of a more long form public intellectual discussion. I enjoy that one as well.
That's awesome. Well, man, let's jump into the book.
Let's do it.
It is really helpful for parents. Most of our listeners are parents or grandparents, and in the description it says, when inevitable questions arise, parents must be equipped with sound biblical answers to guide their children through the complexities of modern life. Because if we fail, and I'm going to probably say this word wrong because I've heard it said different ways, but if we fail to catechize, did I say that right?
You got it right.
If we fail to catechize our children, the world will surely step in and do it for us. Can you define that word, catechize, and explain some of the ways you're seeing the world impacting our children?
Yeah, what a great question, because it's a word that I think has been lost on a lot of contemporary evangelicals. Let's go back, and I'll be brief because otherwise I could spend way too much long on this. In the early church, if you were wanting to become a Christian and become welcomed into the church, you went through this long process of being a catechumen, which meant you were kind of on this long process of discerning and figuring out the demands of the life of the Christian, and that it wasn't just a haphazard thing that you would decide kind of instantaneously. I'm gonna do that thing. You might get saved instantaneously, but it was one of those things where we're gonna test this out. We're gonna train you and equip you and educate you in the contents of the faith in order for you to be matured and discipled. And so that is at the history of the church, at the very beginning. And then when you get into my history might be a little rusty here, but in the Protestant Reformation, upwards from there, you begin to have this emphasis on the creation of catechisms as documents, which are usually in question and answer form, that are meant to help Christians memorize the content of the faith. And one of those questions from the Westminster Confession is, what is the chief end of man? And the answer is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. That's the very first question in the Westminster. And so that has kind of been lost, I think, as liturgical traditions have tended to retreat a little bit. But I actually think that catechisms are coming back, and I'm very encouraged by that. But for all intents and purposes, what we're getting at in the use of catechism is parents need to be the primary catechizers of their children. We need youth ministers, we need children's ministers, but fundamentally, and as a priority, we need parents, because discipleship is a home issue. And that means that needs to be a part of the regular rhythm of a family's, the family's rhythms. So that's what it looks like for our house. At 7:00, we have a time for kind of catechism and discipleship and family worship. It's often a wreck because it never goes according to this idealized way that you have in your mind. But the important thing is we're doing it. And that's what I think we want our children to memorize, to remember as they age out and form their own families, is that our family took time to consecrate the day for the Lord and to teach them the contents of the faith. But as we're thinking about where the world is catechizing us, it's catechizing us in subtle ways and then in very overt ways. And I'm not saying this critically in whatsoever, if you are a Taylor Swift fan, you have been catechized because you have been drawn into the allure of her music and the fact that the Eras tour became this almost liturgical-like event, right? People would go to the concerts and they would be transfixed with the music. People would go and more or less, what's the word? What's the sports term for, if you're like cooking and grilling out before a sports event.
Tailgating.
Yeah. I am indicting myself. You all should be making fun of me if you're listening to this podcast.
Well, we tailgate
People
a lot
would
in
tailgate.
Texas.
Right.
Yeah.
You tailgate at this Taylor Swift concert. Why? Because you're a part of a community. There's a common language, a common sense of identity. You're a Swiftie, right? That's just one subtle way that you're getting catechized. What the world is really, really good at doing that we often have a disadvantage at as Christians is that the world does it in much more subtle forms because we are just constantly immersed in all of the world's systems that are constantly barraging us with what the world wants us to think and be informed by. So social media, YouTubers are a form of catechizers, that we are fundamentally not just passive being. Well, we are passive, but we're fundamentally liturgical and affective beings, meaning that we are constantly being shaped and formed by what is being put into us. And Jesus says what comes out of us is a true measure of what we have been catechized by. And so what we're trying to do in this book is to impress upon parents that given what's taking place in the culture around us, if you think that your kids are just going to go to public school or maybe even Christian school and come out of those environments with this, morally intact, largely Christian understanding of the world, I think that's a very naive assumption because of what the norms are in our society. And so that requires Christians and Christian parents to have a sense of intentionality with instructing their children on these issues that sadly are often putting children and teens in very uncomfortable positions because they're very controversial. And we don't like to be against the grain, right? The human tendency is to want to fit in with the in crowd. But sadly, in many portions of the country, the in crowd is holding to views that are not only contrary to Scripture, but I would argue are contrary to what it means to be human. And so as a way for us to catechize our kids, influence our kids, and quite frankly, to be a voice for sanity in our culture and a voice to love our neighbor into the truth, we have to be intentional about these issues. And so that's really all this book is we can provide all the content that we can imagine and envision and do, but until a parent kind of has a fire under their seat to do this, we can't make someone read the book. We can't make someone have the questions. The parents have to decide to do those things themselves.
Yeah, that's right. And at Empowered Homes, you say that parents have to be the primary catechizer, and we call that primary faith trainer. Same thing.
Right. Same thing.
And that's what we're all about, equipping families and helping them understand that the home is the primary place of discipleship. And, you talk about a lot of the cultural chaos and the things that are coming at our kids and even us as adults, and it's intimidating for parents. And you sort of look at those things and you're like, I want to say the right things. I want to have those conversations, but I don't know how. And so, that's what I love that you, and I don't think we mentioned that Christian wrote this book with you.
She did.
And I love that y'all, that's what you were going after, and you're going after some really tough topics, but you do it in such a really cool, easy to read, practical way. And so if you can, just talk to us a little bit about how each chapter is packed full of resources. Yeah. And I want you to talk about those floors that are in there, because that's really cool.
Yeah. Yeah. So we thought to ourselves, what are we think the 10 most essential topics in the culture today that parents need to be equipping their kids with. And so the really, really challenging thing for me as, and I hate to say this as an academic, that sounds very austere and borderline arrogant, but as someone in the academy who's prone to more kind of maybe heady or intellectual approaches to things, and never one to lack for word counts when I write something, to put it mildly. I'm of the opinion that if I'm going to write something, I need like 20,000 words, which won't get read. So to be forced to take what I think are the essentials of the issue and to boil that down in each chapter to 5 to 7 major like header points. And I would say what we've tried to do in the first section of each chapter is, I do ethics and I do the cultural stuff professionally, and I try to look at it from all angles. And I thought to myself, and it was the most challenging part of writing the book, was to say, okay, what are the 5 to 7 distilled truths that comprehensively cover the issue as much as a busy parent needs to know. And so there's 7 kind of 5 to 7 points of biblical teaching that usually have like a paragraph with each point to kind of flesh out the point that I'm making. And then we, in the middle part of the chapter, we kind of condense the essence of those points into even shorter forms so that parents can have like basically like bullet points and talking points. And then in the third part of each chapter, as you mentioned, Meghan, we talk about these various floors. And we wanted to use the metaphor of the home to communicate kind of what we envision with these floors. And the floors move from general to specific, from simplicity to more complexity. So we have 3 floors with each issue. And the first floor is, generally speaking, ages 4 to 8. The second floor is ages 8 to 12. And then the third floor is roughly ages 12 to 16. And we understand that children develop at different stages. And so these aren't hard and fast principles, but just general rules. Like, this is probably how your child is thinking about this issue at this particular spot in their emotional and intellectual development. And that's actually where my wife's gifting comes in, because she's been a curriculum writer for Lifeway, for the Gospel Project. She led a thriving kids ministry at our previous church in Tennessee, and she's obviously an elementary teacher now. And so we just thought, like, let's use my ethics background, let's use her educational background and early childhood background to provide a resource to make it as accessible and intuitive as possible. And one of the things I want to stress here is our vision to do this book well is not necessarily, and you could do this. You could sit down, take the chapter, and work through it with your child. If you want to do that. We think that child discipleship on these issues occurs best when it's occurring naturally and organically, and as you're just encountering things in the culture. If I can just tell one quick story, kind of how this teases out. We write about it in the book. You know, we have talked about loving our neighbor and caring for the vulnerable, and giving respect and kindness to every human being, regardless of what that person looks like, if that person has some type of intellectual or physical disability, because we've been very clear as soon as our children can understand the concept, is to say, you know what? Every human being is made in God's image. And that means God loves the human beings that he creates. And if he creates those human beings, that means as fellow human beings, we're called to cherish those human beings and respect those human beings because they're special creations of God. And so the image of God, the imago Dei in big fancy theological terms, all of a sudden can be communicated in very simple ways of just compassion, respect. And so one day we were leaving a restaurant, and we saw a young boy in a wheelchair with some severe disabilities was being pushed in by his mother. And I noticed that my younger 2 children were not staring awkwardly, but I could tell that this young boy had kind of caught their attention. And so we were walking out to the car to go back home. We get in the car, and I said to my 2 youngest, I said, girls, I noticed that you saw that young boy who was in a wheelchair, and he obviously had some physical disabilities. I said, I noticed he caught your attention. What caught your attention about him? And they said, well, yeah, it was sad because you could tell that he had some physical limitations. And I said, well, how do you think we should treat someone like that? And they said, oh, well, you know, that boy was made by God. And literally, it would have been my 7-year-old at the time said, yeah, that boy was made in God's image. And so we're called to be kind to him and respect him. And we should never make fun of someone or point out someone's physical problems. And I remember just like being blown away because I never thought, in the process of having those conversations with my kiddos, that someday we're going to have this moment where it's all going to come home, to fruition. But it had, because we had just had normal, everyday conversations along the way. And that's the beauty, I think, of what discipleship is it's almost as though when you're like in this moment, we're like, okay, now we're doing discipleship. We're having discipleship. It's like, well, actually, like, yeah, you might be. That can be a little artificial. Discipleship is being with Jesus. I just preached on John 8 this past weekend. And what does Jesus say in John 8? You have to abide with Jesus. Abiding with Jesus is just like being near Jesus, getting familiar with Jesus. Discipleship for those literal disciples meant like tagging along with them, getting acquainted with him. It was those everyday rhythms where they figured out this is what it means to be a follower of Christ. And so we're trying to mimic that same thing for our children in the home.
Yeah. And we say that all the time. It's not just a one-time conversation. It's multiple conversations about multiple things. It's about being sensitive and intentional about how we're building that culture in our home around the things of God and around what Jesus says for us to respond to the world and how we do that. Man, the 10, I guess, focuses of each chapter, just to name a few, that we can. You're equipping parents so that we can disciple our kids. I mean, abortion, sexuality, gender, homosexuality, identity, transgenderism, technology, political engagement. It just some of the key things for our listeners to maybe curious of like what topics does he hit? I mean, you're going right to the heart of a lot of where our people are really hungry for ways to speak biblical truths into our children, and for us as parents to be able to do that. And so I'm going to put you on the spot, if that's okay. I want to give you.
Let's do it.
I want to give you a real life example that happened at my kitchen table, and I want you to respond to my son and see if I did okay. So last night we're having dinner, and my son says, "Hey, there's a new kid at school," and I was like, "Oh yeah." He's like, "Yeah, I think it's a boy. We have a lot of tomboys at school, but some of the other kids were saying that they had transitioned." He goes, "What do you think about that, Dad?" So how would you respond to your kids coming to you with just a simple, innocent question?
Sure. So, I always want to begin with an affirmation that human beings matter in the eyes of God. So if we're able to establish at the outset that there is an attitude of care and compassion, it means we're tearing down this notion that there has to be, first and foremost, conflict and antithesis. Now, the conflict and antithesis will eventually come, but I don't think that's where the conversation needs to begin. So if that were my child, we would talk about what does it mean to love someone generically as a human being. I think we would then think through the categories of, okay, how would we then have conversations with someone who would have really, really significant disagreements with us? We would then probably try to figure out, okay, if there are significant disagreements, are there any commonalities that we could establish amongst that kind of big ideological and moral difference to figure out, like, all right, this is why that person is thinking the way that they're thinking. This is the way that I'm thinking. But then figuring out, like, okay, what things might we have in common? What I would then do is to go to the Bible, and I would say, okay, when we see God make human beings, we see that God makes human beings how and in what forms. And I think my children would say, well, when we look at Genesis, there are man and woman. So I then would think we would go with, okay, so God makes man and woman. So that's an issue of authority, right? So then the issue needs to become for the children. So, okay, if God creates and God is a good God, then his creation is inherently good. That then raises the question of, okay, well, why do people feel the sense of alienation and brokenness and confusion that they do? Well, that can be because of our doctrine of sin, and that sin works its way into the world comprehensively, into our thoughts, into our desires, into our perceptions. But it also means that we have an opportunity to explain and I hate to use the word empathize. Empathize is good, not empathize with fallenness, but empathize with the reality that there is brokenness in the world. And so that right out of the gate, we're understanding that we have a vocabulary for why people would think the way that they do. Now, we might think that they're mistaken about how they're thinking about this. And so I remember one time we had my oldest daughter saw a same-sex couple on TV. And we had a conversation about that. And, we had been building a worldview where she understood that marriage was one man and one woman. And she had that building block squared away. And she said, well, why would people think that you could be two husbands or two wives in a relationship? And I said, well, people do think differently than us. I think that doctrine of sin allows us to understand and communicate to our children why people would think differently about certain matters. Okay, then if we establish that sin creates divergence and disagreements and rebellion against God's creation order, the question then becomes, how do we then treat people who think differently than us? And I think that's where Christian virtues of love and compassion enter into the equation. And I remember saying to my daughter, we do disagree with how these people understand what marriage is and how they are to relate to one another as two men. But we are not going to sacrifice the truth, but we can show love amidst disagreement. And to communicate to them, and we're clear about this. Just because you communicate love doesn't mean that your love will be met with an equal measure of respect. And that's why we wrote a chapter on hostility and persecution.
Yeah.
And to communicate to them that you can go out of your way to communicate love and good intentions, and that still may be met with a degree of criticism. But again, it comes back to the question of who has ultimate authority.
Yeah, that's so good. I took all the notes, and I did okay. I did all right. We talked about, I asked the question. I was like, with this person, how do you think God views them? How do you think God sees them? And do you see them the way that God sees them? And then one of our core values as a family, we make my kids say it all the time. Coolies, we're leaders. We're kind. We get back up and we know God and make Him known. That's like our core values that we have them. And so I said, "Are you a coolie?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Aren't we kind?" He said, "Yeah, I'm going to be kind." And then he goes, "So it's okay for me to be friends with them?" I said, "We're friends to everybody, buddy.
Yep, absolutely.
We're friends with everybody, and so we can be kind, and we can still toe that line of showing that love and kindness, even though we disagree." And so I did okay.
I think you gave a better, more concise answer than I gave. So kudos to you.
Well, boys are different than girls. It'd be like a 2-hour conversation if it was.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. Yeah.
So
it's so good, and I love it. I love that we have this like-hearted, just mission for family, and just that core of how God created family and how important it is, for us to reflect His image and speak that into our children, and even for grandparents that can do that into their grandchildren and all of that. And so we're so grateful that you wanted to join us and talk about that. And one thing I want to know before you go, and this is kind of getting off topic of the book, but one thing I want to know is, People, they live in a place for a long time and they tend to not actually experience the place that they live in. So I want to know, in Louisville, Kentucky, where do you go to have fun with your family?
Oh, goodness. Well, this is going to be the most cliche Christian answer you could expect. Chick-fil-A for one of them.
Nice.
Not on Sunday.
That's obviously an answer. One thing that we enjoy doing as a family is going on walks in our neighborhood. And then we also enjoy going to the movies. And so we have gotten to that stage of life, especially with our older daughter. She's a very reserved, doesn't really ask for a whole lot. And so I go out of my way to communicate with her, like, hey, if you want to do something, like, name it. And if we can't do it, we won't do it. But she's just someone who doesn't really think she wants to ask. And so for she and I, she loves going to the mall and, maybe doing a little bit of shopping. For the younger two, a trip to the candy store goes a long way as well. But the other thing that we have really we enjoy doing is on Friday nights, oftentimes, is because everyone's schedules are so busy. Friday night at home with a pizza and a movie in the living room really is one of the greatest sources of joy and respite and calm for our family right now.
Yeah, I love that. We've had to kind of shift our family fun night. That's what we call it around the last couple of weeks because it changes when we're all together because we've got so much stuff going around. But it's definitely important. Well, man, so grateful for the book. So grateful for you. Again, the book is called "What Do I Say When?" A Parent's Guide to Navigating Cultural Chaos for Children and Teens. I love the discussion or the questions that you have in there, the conversation starters that you have in there. Each chapter it gives parents handlebars to really do what we want to do, and that's to disciple our kids towards the heart of Jesus. And it's a fantastic resource. So for the listeners, where can they grab a copy of this book?
Sure. So, obviously Amazon has it available. Crossway's website has it available. And it's been really encouraging, the response to the book. And I think what has been really humbling, you write a book and you hope people will read it. And then when people do read it, and it's humbling because you're thinking like, why would you read this, right? Maybe there's like some imposter syndrome at the heart of my psychology right there. But no, it's been so encouraging, like the number of churches that have wanted to buy it in bulk. And so Crossway has, they're the publisher, and so they have the mechanisms available for it to be purchased in bulk, and that means like a bigger discount as well. So yeah Amazon and Crossway would be the best two places.
Yeah, so if you're listening, this is a must-have for every parent, especially those with teens who are in the throes of culture and the chaos of culture. So, man, thank you so much for your time today. Just so honored to have you and our continued like-hearted partnership. Man, we are so grateful for all the work you're doing and continue to do. And, man, I hope you and your craziness and your schedule right now and your wife starting school, that y'all have some time in the next couple of weeks to really have that family night and spend some time together, because so vital for all of us. For those of you listening, if you want more resources when it comes to being the primary faith trainer, leading at home, you can always access all of our incredible resources at empoweredhomes.org. Meghan, thanks. Andrew, thank you so much.
Thank you.